the profound responsibility of doing workshops or teaching a class or whatever else in any mentoring capacity, you never quite know when you're opening a door that has completely altered the trajectory of a child's life and maybe opened the door that quite literally saved their life.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to From the Magic Pencil, Voices of Writing Through. I am so excited for this episode because I get to have an amazing chat with the incredible Carlos Andrés Gómez, who is an award-winning poet in the US, and I recently got the great pleasure to work with in person here in Cambodia and to see him perform and inspire. So I am absolutely thrilled to have him here. So hello, Carlos.
Kristin, always wonderful to see you and to chat with you. I'm so honored to be on your podcast. I feel like it was such an incredible experience. For those of you who might be tuning in, if you don't know more about it, obviously you know about Writing Through, but we did this incredible collaboration in conjunction with the U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh and several other organizations. And the project was called the Great Lake Poets Express, and it was working with students in Prek, the floating village on the Tonle Sap Lake. And it was truly one of my life highlights. And I've gotten to do some really cool things in my life as a poet and as an artist and as an educator and as a collaborator. And this was one of the most special, indelible memories of my life. And it was such a joy to work with you, Kristin, because we've all collaborated with folks where you don't necessarily get to pick who you collaborate with. And that can be a wonderful gift or it can be a tremendous challenge. And it was great to collaborate with you because you're just a wonderful, interesting person and an incredible educator. And I feel like I left with a friend, which was like an absolute best outcome in addition to doing an incredible project.
And just since we only do this as an audio podcast, I am blushing extremely hard right now. Just a little video description there. I would say exactly the same. It was life-changing. It's probably one of the coolest things I've ever done in my professional life. And it's something that I'm not ever going to forget and will continue to be inspired by. And inspired by the young people that we were lucky enough to work with their teachers, with the poets, with the community, everything. Just life-changing. And I think we all need those moments sometimes, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So creativity is something that we work with a lot in our lives. I teach creative thinking. Do you think that beyond the work that you do you think that you live a creative life?
Absolutely. I mean, I think something I often say is that I feel like my foundational training as an artist and as a writer and as a performer was in being kind of a displaced new kid my whole life growing up. I moved 12 times before I graduated high school, lived in 4 countries, was sort of juggling 7 or 8 different languages, went to 12 schools. And so I was constantly the kid that felt like he was on the outside. I had imaginary friends, not because it was cute, but because it was a necessity since I didn't have any other friends at several points in my childhood. And I think that the gift of that, though, on the other side, it was very difficult at the time in some of those periods of my life, was it taught me to be a really good listener and a really good observer. And I think one of the most essential parts for me about being an artist is a kind of rigorous attention. And through that sort of investigation of things that are often overlooked, taken for granted by most people, it opens up the opportunity to have a different relationship with it. And I know I have this all the time where my partner kind of rolls her eyes because there are things that everyone else feels very on board with. And I'll just kind of say, what about this though? Anybody wonder about this? And everyone's like, oh, really? But it's a different kind of relationship. And to me, it's a kind of critical engagement in a kind of critical lens. And obviously, I mean critical about like a intensity of engagement, not a negative critique, that I think enables a much more present, humane engagement with my life. I think it's something that's very counteractive to the kind of autopilot that I think so much modern technology, and I'm speaking particularly in the US, kind of wants to do everything for us. So we're very much not really the drivers of our life. And so for me, I think that my creative impulse inflects through every dimension of my life, from the way I parent to my relationship with my partner to how I interact with the person at the cash register at the grocery store. And then, of course, in the way that I write and I perform, I'm always thinking about what are ways I can turn this thing, or what if I turn it and hold this thing up to the light and I look at this part for the first time. So yeah, I think it's very much something that informs all aspects of my life and living.
Amazing. So I have spoken to you about this previously, and it's such a cool story. And one of the questions that we always like to delve into when we're doing these episodes is whether there was a moment in your life or your education that helped you get to the point where you are now. And I think you have the best story, which I would love it if you would tell it, or if you have another story about when your eyes were kind of opened to the kind of life that you've ended up leading.
Absolutely. So for me, I mean, when I was 17 years old, it was a very difficult moment in my life. I'd been chronically ill for several years. My parents had gotten divorced. I'd moved 2 or 3 times. I'd been kicked out of a Catholic school. That was all in the last 3 years prior to me being 17. I was very much struggling with what I felt like were pressures on all sides of me to be a version of masculinity that had nothing to do with who I was. And so I was very quietly despairing state, managing the confluence of things I just named. And in that era, I know we live in a kind of hopefully a more hopeful era now, even though I think the pendulums may be swinging back to a less hopeful era in terms of masculinities and men. But in the world that I lived in, I didn't believe that you could be both an athlete and an artist. I believed that I had to pick one, and I was very much the athlete archetype. I was co-captain of the basketball team. I played multiple sports. Basketball was a big part of my identity. And I'd actually been quietly writing poems for a few months and having a bit of an identity crisis about it that I didn't show anybody after I watched this film Slam, starring Saul Williams and Sonia Sang. And we had a mandatory assembly, and it was this incredible poet named Martín Espada who was coming to read from his collection, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And of course, I kind of walked in late. Couple of friends from the basketball team. I sit in the back row. I'm kind of like, like poetry. Oh, you know what I mean? But of course, inside, Kristin, I know you've worked with 17-year-olds before. It's like whatever you're seeing is nearly irrelevant. I always think, it's like all the iceberg, the contrived iceberg metaphors. It's like, with an adolescent, that's like extreme. You know what I mean? Whatever you're seeing is like maybe not even the tip of the iceberg. There's tons of interior life happening. And this is a lesson that I think many of us have to learn over and over again, particularly if you work with adolescents. I always joke, as a teacher, I have kids who are totally checked out or seem to be the whole year. And then the last day, they're hysterically sobbing and saying you changed their life. And, you're like, what? I saw none of this for a year. Like, what is this? You know what I mean? So I'm very much that 17-year-old. And I sit in the back row, and Martín Espada starts reading from his collection. And it was the first time I'd been in a room with a poet or any writer that I remember at that point that was naming things and articulating things that I felt like only lived inside of me. And it was such a profoundly spiritual, revelatory moment for me. I've since rediscovered a lot of the traditional, white canonical writers that you get in public school in the United States. And many of them I adore, like Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, Walt Whitman, etc. But at this point, I didn't feel really any inspiration or connection to poetry or those writers. And Martín Espada felt like he was naming things that I thought I only felt. And I sat in the back of the auditorium. I just wept. And people were just shocked. It was a complete contradiction to everything that I performed in my life. It was like all the masks I'd been wearing all just fell away. And I walked up to Martín Espada at the end of his reading, and I looked at him, and it was like he literally pointed and he looked at me, and he was like, "What's your name?" And I could just say my name. That's all I could say. And he kind of nodded, he pointed, and he took the book out of my hand that I just bought, and he wrote on the inside of the cover, he wrote, "Para Carlos, poeta del futuro, Martín Espada." For Carlos, poet of the future. And he handed the book back. And it was like, up to that point, this may sound silly, but my only goal was to be like a starting shooting guard in the NBA. That was my plan. I still thought it was a long shot, but I was like, I'm going to somehow do it. You know what I mean? Like, and he was like, you know what? Maybe you're actually a poet, which is probably even more absurd than maybe becoming an NBA player, maybe even today to a lot of people. And it's so wild because I think we don't know, especially when we're in the role of mentor or educator, even if it's briefly to a young person. I know you know this, Kristin. I know this, the profound responsibility of doing workshops or teaching a class or whatever else in any mentoring capacity. You never quite know when you're opening a door that has completely altered the trajectory of a child's life and maybe opened the door that quite literally saved their life. And people always say, what does a poem do? You know what I mean? Like, what real impact does it have? And I say, poetry has a transformative, life-altering power, a life-saving power. And people will say, you have no definitive proof of that. And I say, I do. And I point at myself. I have definitive proof. If there's no other example in history, that day Martín Espada saved my life, changed the trajectory of my life, gave me permission to be a poet, period. That is unassailable proof. And that is something that I can never abandon when I am ever feeling cynical or doubting the power of creative expression or art. I think of myself at 17. I mean, I don't know how much longer I would have been alive if I hadn't had that moment with Martín Espada, if I'm really candid about it. It opened this door. It opened this door inside of me. It opened this door in my life. It's wild because almost 20 years to the day that I had that experience with Martín Espada, he wrote the introduction to my first poetry book, Hijito, which is an incredible, I mean, it's such an incredible introduction. And then a year or two after that, I helped him launch his book, Floaters. We were in conversation. I hosted his event, and his book Floaters went on to win the National Book Award the next year. You know, he's remained like a mentor and somebody I value and I cherish and follow his work, and he follows my work. It's been this incredible, just incredible, that relationship and the power of the word and the power of that day. So I'll say this, in the many years since that day, I mean, that was 25 years ago. I mean, I've probably done well over 2,000 gigs at this point. I've had several adults who encountered my work when they were in high school, who've told me that I was their Martín Espada because they knew that story or they read my memoir. And it's been like incredible to think about them becoming that to another person that's younger. Like, this is how it works. Whether I'm in front of 25,000 people or 2 people, I always think, is me at 17 in the audience? And there's always that possibility. And that's why I say anybody who ever sees me perform or read my poetry, I always say, it is always the only time I will ever do this. It is always the first time. It is always the last time. It is always the only time. Because there's no promise it won't be the last time. And it might as well be the only time. Because whoever I'm in front of, whoever I'm sharing space with, is the most important group of people I will ever be in front of until the next group. So yeah, that's my story about the power of poetry and the power of art and creative expression.
I remember the first time I saw you perform, which was in a very hot, very small room upstairs at a bar that I go to regularly. And you said that line. And then not long after, you performed an improv poem, which I think everyone's jaws were on the floor. It was so cool to watch you just take these little cues that you're given from the audience on the fly and put together not only a real poem, but the way you did it was just beautiful. And I think that was the moment where I kind of went, oh my God, who are these guys? Who am I working with here? This is incredible. Do you just always have so many ideas floating around your brain that you just need a little hook to kind of put them together?
This is the best way that I can explain it. You know, the things that shape us will forever live inside of us. I was a very delayed reader, and I think that's probably for several reasons. I may have an undiagnosed learning difference. I mean, I tried to learn to read and grew up in the 80s. You're in public school in the 80s, they're just like, here's like a hooked on phonics book. If you don't get this, you're just dumb, and we'll put you in like another classroom and hope you don't starve. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that was my experience. So, I mean, I didn't learn to speak English until I was 5, and I didn't learn to read until I was 9. And I think that was for a lot of things. I learned in the British system, which was word memorization versus phonetics, which I think already was, you know, it's like echinacea, like eucalyptus, you know, like there's like no sense to it. Yeah, very useful, but totally like nonsensical. And then I moved over to phonetics, but I was like learning that when I didn't really know English yet. And then I'm trying to learn phonetics, and I learned no English, but I'm still, you know, plus I may have had a learning difference, but I had an incredible memory. So I could memorize where words were in books and then fake like I could read. which is, I think, a problem in itself.
Um,
And I was also a really good public speaker, but I literally didn't know how to read. So I'd be in front of class reading books because I memorized where the words were and I memorized the story, or close enough that the teacher was fooled. But that's all to say, literacy gave me a lot of anxiety. And then when I was like 13 and 14, I fell in love with hip hop. And then I had friends who were battle rappers. So I'd go to see MC battle and I'd just be sitting on the sideline. And so I think I was learning all these writing techniques just by watching people battle. But of course, none of it's all off the dome. And it's also like I'm not seeing it written, but it's also teaching me all this writing literacy oriented stuff in a way that felt very accessible and democratic that I didn't feel intimidated by. And so I think hip hop in many ways opened a certain door for me. And then, of course, it was like Saul Williams, which is definitely influenced by hip hop. And then Martín Espada, who's influenced by the Nuyorican tradition. I mean, he's Nuyorican himself, Puerto Rican from Brooklyn. So it's like there are all these things that are sort of closely related that I think opened up all these possibilities. Now, it's like later I studied for 4 years at Upright Citizens Brigade in New York City. So I've studied, Herald long form improv and all those other things. I think a lot of it is just about surrendering and having faith and not panicking and knowing that there's a sort of infinite well of creativity that we all have access to if we surrender to it and have faith. And trusting that everyone in the room and everyone with you is a resource of knowledge that is going to gift you the things that you need. I know it sounds really set up like kind of like woo and spiritual and whatever else, but truly, like I've done freestyles in front of thousands of people in ridiculous circumstances. And it's weird. Like I'll give myself parameters I'll attempt to set myself up to fail. And it will be something miraculous because I'm not trying to achieve something. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to do something cool. It's not capitalism. Do you know what I mean? I'm not trying to sell something here. I'm just surrendering to something and knowing that what's the famous Miles Davis line? Like, there's no wrong note. It's just whatever note you're playing right now. Because if somebody hits a wrong note, you can freestyle around that wrong note and then make a creative landscape around it that makes it actually the right note. Because in fact, there are no wrong notes. I think that's a kind of faith and a kind of trust also that I think there's so much, especially as an artist or even a performer in a live setting, where there's so many ingrained things about like, what if I screw up or what if people aren't impressed? That's all going to just kill creativity. Like if you're worried about impressing people, screwing up, you got to relish a deep failure. I've had so many deep failures. I love them. They're great. They're like useful. And once you have a lot of experience, it's harder to find them. So you literally have to seek them out, which to me is interesting. Like I love awkwardness. I love awkward moments. And I know for most people, they're like, why would anybody like that? It's so human. Like to me, there's such humanity that is made possible when we have these embarrassing moments, awkward moments. I love that. You know what I'm saying? Like all of us had a crush on someone maybe when we were in 7th grade and we're like, I never want to feel this vulnerable and this raw ever again. But then you become an adult and you're like, what I would give to feel that again. Do you know what I'm saying? Is that not true?
It is very true. It's just very salient right now because I witnessed one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen this weekend, and it did not involve me, and I still wanted to disappear. Are you going to tell me, or you can't tell me? I'll tell you. So I went to a Cambodian wedding. Well, it was actually a wedding between a Cambodian woman and an American man. They've been living in Arizona for the last few years. Okay. And have come back to get married in the traditional way for her family. So it's really fun. It's been this great reunion of friends. And one of the bridesmaids' boyfriends came, and he has never participated in any Cambodian cultural things before. And there's this ceremony.
Is this American?
No, he's British. Okay. And this ceremony is called the hair cutting ceremony, where everybody comes up by twos, goes behind the bride and groom, and mimes cutting hair. It's symbolic of. Oh no, it's not what you think. It's even worse because the groom has a shaved head, so he did not accidentally cut anything. So you're symbolically cutting off like the past life to begin the new life together, right? Beautiful. And it involves taking the scissors, the comb, miming, and then you show them themselves in the mirror. You give them some little well wishes. And they have a bottle of perfume that you generally mime spraying, and this guy put the bottle right to the groom's eye and sprayed it right in his eye. And my husband went, oh, he's crying. He must be so emotional. And I looked up and his head was down on the table. And he came up and he was in agony. They had to stop the whole ceremony while everyone ran to get him eye drops and eye cleaner and everything. Oh. And the entire time, the guy who did it and another friend of mine were just stood behind them. It lasted at least 15 minutes. They were just standing there with no clue what to do.
Oh no.
I've never wanted to disappear off the face of the earth more. And then the guy comes and sits right in front of us and turns around and goes, "Oh, I can't believe that happened." And I was like, I don't want to be associated.
No, wait, the guy who sprayed the perfume said that to you?
Yeah, and I'm just like, I'm gonna go over there now.
Oh my. Okay, I will say that's an awkward I don't love as much. I like the awkward where like no one's hurt or in discomfort. Okay, let me clarify. Maybe like I love lower stakes, good humored awkward. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't want to see like a bride trip and fall on her wedding cake and her hair light on fire. You know, like America's Funniest Video stuff. I'm like, that's not funny. Like, no, I don't love that.
Yeah, low stakes. I get that. It comes back to the same idea that something that we really try to instill when we're doing the workshop is the idea of stopping yourself from stopping yourself, right? Like
Yes.
we all have that
Yes.
inner critic and we all have those voices telling us, what if you make a mistake? What if you stumble? I've seen a lot of people try to do improv and just not allow themselves to dive in head first, which I think is just the only way to do it.
As many acting teachers or improv teachers I've had have said, there are two ways to commit. It's either 1,000,000% or zero. You might as well commit to zero if you're going to commit to less than 1,000,000. When I'm committed to something, I'm risking it all. I'm going all in. There's nothing saved. And if I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail epically. I'm just going to live in it. And it'll just be a good story, hopefully, later. I think also that even the idea, like our relationship to failure, that I think is so deeply unproductive. I'm a recovering perfectionist. And perfectionism is the death of art, first of all. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like things that were ingrained, I think ingrained from my mother in particular, but just these ideas that failure is something to fear, which I think at this point in my life, I mean, I'm absolutely irreverent about failure. Like I'm like looking for failure. I'm like relishing failure. I think to do anything meaningful, to grow meaningfully, to have a meaningful life, I mean, you're going to have all different kinds of things that are temporary failures. I think for me, one thing that's useful is that all art is failure until it's not. That's part of the process. And I think too, no failure is ultimately failure unless you stop going. If you continue on, it's just a temporary setback. It's not really failure at all. Exactly. It's just a step. I think too, especially when art gets in that really sticky, fraught territory of being evaluated by people that are not you, there's so many complex, predictable, less predictable, politicized, socio-cultural dimensions to what gets celebrated and what doesn't. What gets a platform and what doesn't. And so I always try to tell younger artists, especially, I'm like, when you're putting yourself out there, you got to be an anthropologist about this. When the work goes out, you need to then become an anthropologist. You can't be the artist with like their whole soul emptied and opened up to the world. You're going to have to close that up when you're waiting for like what should be dozens and dozens and hundreds or maybe even thousands of rejection letters. You know what I'm saying? Because there's so many different things that factor into this. Like, and I've been on the other side of it where I've been a judge for prizes or other things. I mean, listen, if anyone ever even gets any feedback at all related to a prize or an accolade, you won. Because once it gets that final stage, it's ridiculous. If anybody's ever judged something, pretty much across the board, if it's 5 people, if it's 10, if it's 50, every time I've been on a judging panel, the one that I thought was unassailably the winner was the one that was at the bottom for another judge. And not bottom as in they were bad, as in they were just like, this is fantastic, but these are my other favorites. Mm-hmm. And I have the order reversed from you. And I think both of us have credible, justifiable explanations for why we think this person should get this versus that one. So I think it's so hard. Like the things ultimately that determine why somebody gets an opportunity, it's kind of absurd, to be honest with you. And it's so competitive. That's a hard thing, I know, especially for younger artists, you know, this relationship to perceived failure. I've had a lot of different opportunities that I've gotten and different things that have recognized my work in different ways. Talk about the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I've had thousands and thousands of rejections. Like I'm constantly submitting, applying, and recognizing that there's a whole host of reasons why my work may not get a thing. It often may not have to do with me, my work being the so-called best. Like we have to disentangle ourselves from our relationship to meritocracy. I'm speaking especially to the Americans who might be tuning in, who are we're socialized to believe in a meritocracy. You know, as one of my most prized like acting coach, cherished acting mentor, Bob Krakow, often said, and he's talking about casting, especially with acting. So this is very specific to acting. But he was like, listen, he's like, I talk to other casting directors and they would say, I really want to cast this person because they remind me of my ex. Or they'll say, yeah, I don't want to cast this person because they remind me of my ex. You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't like that person's teeth. It's like, what are you talking about? This is what happens when humans get involved in their gatekeepers. And I think that's the thing we don't want to accept. We don't want to believe, oh, it was some arbitrary ridiculousness I couldn't account for versus maybe I'm just an awful artist and my work is crap. Like, no, that's not it. That's not necessarily it at all.
Have you ever had a piece that you think deserves everything, not get it, and then another piece that you didn't feel as confident about get something?
That's the rule and not the exception. I was literally just having a conversation with a friend of mine about this. I'll give you a couple of examples of awards I've gotten that I was completely shocked by. In 2015, I won the Lucille Clifton Poetry Prize. They asked for 4 poems in the submission. And I was in graduate school. I finally had some poems that I thought were, I still actually think they were probably the 3 best poems I've ever written up to that point. So I put those 3 poems in the queue and I was like, these are the 3 best poems I've ever written. I think it's an incredible long shot to win anything, of course, always. But I was like, if by some miracle I won this, it's going to be one of these 3 poems. And then I was like, should I toss in a 4th? So I had what I thought was like an early draft of a poem called Hijito. My feedback from my supervisor was like, yeah, we got a lot more work to do on it. I don't know. I was like, I don't know. It seemed like an interesting poem, but it didn't feel like it was finished. And I didn't even know if it was a poem, to be honest with you. So I tossed it in as the 4th poem. I sent out the submission. 7 months later, I find out I won the Lucille Clifton Poetry Prize with that 4th poem, Hijito. And I was just completely stunned. I was like, what? Another one, I won the Sandy Crimmins National Prize for Poetry on a poem that I actually think is one of the better poems I've ever written called Elegy for Breath. But it's one of the few poems I've never gotten any editorial feedback on. Like I just worked on it myself for several years, but I never got any outside feedback, which is not a good plan ever. And it won the prize. Like even the Yates Poetry Prize recently, I mean, the poem's like a formally complex, innovative poem. And I care about the poem, but I mean, I put it last in the pack. I didn't think it was one of the 2 or 3 strongest in the pack that I submitted, and it won that prize. So it's kind of haunting because then it's like, do I not have any gauge about like what good? I mean, it's so subjective, you know. And the joke I make with a lot of my friends who submit things for publication is we often say like, here are 3 poems I've worked on for 4 years. And here's like an excerpt of a draft I wrote an hour ago. And that's the one that like the nation picks up. More than anything, I think that also should implore us as artists, don't be afraid to throw in some like wild off the wall thing. Like throw something wild in there. I mean, that's a good suggestion for auditioning too. You know, one thing that Bob Krakow would often say, almost everyone is shooting kind of down the middle. So if you just do something weird, that'll probably just get you a call back, even if it's not good. Because it'll just be interesting. And that to me is like an interesting suggestion for life. Don't be afraid to chase down something very bizarre and weird. It's like, you know, no surprise for the actor, no surprise for the audience. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And I think one rule that I often have when I write is to have no idea where I'm going to end and give myself permission to end anywhere. Like, I love a poem where you enter and you're like, oh my gosh, I got transported to this world. It ended in a place I couldn't possibly fathom. I think that's something that's interesting, especially if somebody's reading hundreds or thousands of poems. They want something to say, oh my gosh, what is this person doing? This is so weird and interesting. I don't know, when I've had to look through stuff as a judge, I'm like, what's the weird stuff that's different? You know, sometimes a well-wrought line is not enough. Sometimes like something that is completely arresting and captivating because it's so surprising.
Yeah, I find, especially working with younger people, sometimes encouraging them to be silly, you know, like when we're creating metaphors and stuff like that, I love to ask them something completely off the wall, like, okay, what's something stinky? What's something gross? And the more they get into it, the more they kind of loosen up. It doesn't mean that they have to write something silly, but just being free to be silly, I think, is liberating.
You know, one thing about that, to me, it goes back to also surprise, which I think is like one of the most vital tools that I reach for is completely like subverting expectations, surprise. You know, it's like you look at somebody who's more experienced doing a really devastating scene as an actor. So I'll give you a classic example. You take an inexperienced actor, you say, okay, here's a scene. And they say, okay, what's happening? Okay, so you're eating a sandwich. Then you get a phone call and you find out someone you love has just died. So the inexperienced actor, what happens when they're waiting for the phone? They're sitting there on this phone. They're just like really histrionic and there might be tears already coming down their face. And then before the scene starts, the teacher's like, what are you doing? The person's like, I'm going to get this phone call about someone dying. Nobody's died yet. Like in real life, when people find out that they get the call of their life, they're annoyed. They're watching TV and eating chips. They're laughing at like a funny reel on Instagram. They're like running late for work and annoyed with their kid. You know, they're having sex. Like that's real life. Life interrupts life. I wrote a poem recently that I wrote quite literally in a a Lyft ride to Brooklyn from the airport. Anyway, I probably wrote it in like 20 minutes. I think it's one of the better poems I've ever written. I think it's one of the better poems I've ever written because it allows in all this life in all these different dimensions. Like one of my dreams in life is to like talk junk, speak on the profound, be vulnerable, call myself out, taunt the reader. I want to do that all in one poem. I like somebody who can like tell a joke and then like call out genocide and then give crap to their annoying best friend and then like also have that be a way to show that they love that best friend, because that feels like it's living in the messy complexity and depth of humanity that I aspire toward. And I think a lot of times with a lot of art, you see it kind of one-dimensionalized or one note because someone's like, oh, this is a serious poem or this is a silly poem. But you see an experienced actor take on a scene like that and they might actually continue smiling when they get the call about the thing happening. Because people know that when people are really uncomfortable or really upset, sometimes they laugh, sometimes they smile, sometimes they mask.
Sometimes they can't even absorb the news.
Maybe they laugh, they take the phone, and they put it down, and they go back to watching TV. Maybe that's the scene. You see what I'm saying? And so I think it's one of those things too. It's like, I think that's really good advice. A trick I often give myself is whatever the contrasting emotion is, what's a way to allow space for that unexpectedly? And that often can open up a lot of emotion. Like if somebody says, give yourself permission to laugh, someone laughs, and guess what happens right after that? Then they start weeping. It's the whole thing about like, it's about as a writer, you try to go in the front door, you very rarely get let in the front door. And so I think that's the great thing about like great writing exercises. You were giving some great, when we were working with the kids at Prek, it's like a great writing exercise can help you unlock your subconscious and give you a way to surprise yourself so you can surprise your reader.
Yeah, I love that. And I always give the example as well, which is something that I learned about when I was studying psychology, that actually happens in our brains. When we get stuck in one idea, we completely close off all of the connections to all of the other ideas, right? And this is actually a synaptic plasticity neuroscience thing, but it's real. And I always give that example when we're talking about our rules of like, don't think, don't push it, because maybe it is in the window upstairs. We're just stuck with that tunnel vision and we've closed off all of the other opportunities. And I often also give the example of when you meet somebody and you just can't remember their name and you're trying so hard and you're like, it starts with a J, doesn't it? It's definitely a J. And then later on you're washing the dishes or something and all of a sudden you're like, Carlos!
not J at all.
You got yourself stuck in that one incorrect thing and you forgot everything else.
There's something that my acting teacher used to say, and I often say with people of all kinds of artists, if you feel stuck, what's something physical and embodied that you like to do? Like I go play basketball and I'm not trying to solve problems. I'm just trying to enjoy playing basketball. And suddenly I resolve all these issues. Don't necessarily sit there and bang your head against the wall, figuratively and maybe literally. Go breakdance and come back to it.
I don't particularly enjoy running, but it's something that I try to do regularly. And that is when I solve every problem in my head.
Ooh, yes.
Mostly because I'm trying to escape from the fact that I'm running and I don't like it.
Yes.
Something that when we were talking before about your kind of eye-opening moment, do you think there is an age where people are more receptive to developing creativity?
I don't believe there's a window. I do believe there's a time when people are more receptive, generally, but that's maybe not always true because all people aren't the same. I'll say this. I'm going to go back to that same acting class. I had a classmate of mine and friend of mine, Maxine Prescott. When I first had class with her, she was 82 years old and she'd been acting for 15 years. And she was the best actress in the class. I don't really want to speak on her life, but she survived a lot of really difficult, challenging things that did not make it possible for her to pursue acting until she left her partner when she was 67. When she was 67, she picked up what she had done as a little girl, literally like 60 years earlier. I don't know where Maxine is. I knock on wood. I hope she is still alive and still acting. I have not looked her up in a while, but she was a series regular on several series on major network TV. She did film, television, all this other stuff. She did not pick up acting again until she was 67, but she had a deep love for it when she was a little girl. And she was absolutely brilliant, / is brilliant wherever she is. Yeah, I don't believe there's a window. I will say this, though. I think a lot of this is self-generated. I think there's a kind of calcification that a lot of us adults, and I'm including myself in that, resign ourselves to that's deeply unproductive and counteractive to growth and us evolving. That I think that because of a lot of the socialized narratives around being younger, I think young people generally are more open-minded to the possibility of recognizing a revelatory moment or lending themselves to this transformative moment that might emerge. That's one of the reasons why I love working with kids in the US who are in high school or college, is I think there's so many things that you hear, and I know I heard before I went to college, and even when I was high school, it's like, this is going to be, the best years of your life or a transformative time or whatever else. And whatever opinions we have about that, I do think that there's this expectation, we're socialized to believe, and I can speak at least in the United States, that there are going to be moments where our lives are transformed, where we come to a fork in the road and we get to pick one. By no means the only time in our life, but I think that there's a kind of receptiveness that young people have at that stage in their lives, where when I encounter adults, I don't see that same kind of receptiveness with the kind of frequency. There are absolutely times I do, and there also can be other catalysts for this too, right? Like somebody entering sobriety, or somebody, their marriage ends, or somebody loses a partner or a sibling or a best friend or their parents. So there are other things that can be catalysts of like, okay, I'm open to the revelatory possibilities of this life as adults. But I think it takes a major catalyst in a way that when I encounter a 16-year-old, they're more frequently just like, wow, maybe I'm a poet, which a 46-year-old, it's a lot less likely that they might say that.
I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that pretty much everyday experiences for teenagers feel like catalyst moments.
100%. It's like you break up with your girlfriend and you're 14. It's like, my life has ended. Like, there's nothing else I'm going to do. I'll never be loved again. I'll never find anybody ever again. And it doesn't matter what adult is going to say, that may not be the case. I can't guarantee it, but it's not super likely this is like the be all end all relationship of your life. But I'm also an adult, so I clearly don't know anything, and you're 14. But yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't know how you felt that, Kristin, but I remember having huge feelings when I was a teenager. Literally, that was me. I remember breaking up with my first major girlfriend when I was 14 and feeling like quite literally not sure what the rest of this life was going to hold. And I was fine.
Not being invited to a birthday party
totally
was the worst feeling in the world, and everyone
100%.
would remember it forever.
Totally.
Which, when you're older, of course, you look back at that and go, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. But I can still look back at some of that stuff, and I still feel that young person feeling. Right?
Oh,
you remember the impact that it had on you.
I mean, I don't know how it is in Canada, but I know in the US, there's so much stuff around prom and this idea of who you're going with to prom. I mean, I did not personally experience this. I think my social standing in high school gave me certain privileges. And also, like, I went with people that I wanted to go with, and also didn't care that much about prom. But I think I was insulated, or I didn't have to care about prom because my social status. Yeah, candidly, I was a popular kid, not in like the mean archetype way. Like, I was friends with everybody, and I had the privilege of saying, I don't care if I go to prom, I'll go. But I also recognize that somebody who's in a different situation, I mean, I knew people who they were like, my life is dependent on if this person goes with me to prom, which I can imagine at 37 feels differently. Maybe it doesn't, I don't know, than it does when you're 17. You see this reinforced in movies in the US, this big crescendo, like my whole high school career. I mean, there was, that really toxic trope in so many, I guess, 90s, even 80s movies. If you're a guy, you got to go to prom and lose your virginity on prom night, or you failed high school or whatever.
Yeah, if you go to college and you haven't...
And you haven't had sex, you're like, you failed. There's a lot to unpack there about how toxic and destructive it is. But yeah, again, though, it's like the other side of that coin, the kind of circling back to the broader ideas we were talking about before. I think joy is twins with sorrow. And I think celebration is twins with grieving. And so I think in that way, the gift of being an adolescent, there are all these revelatory possibilities. The curse of being an adolescent is you can be absolutely devastated or crushed by the 2-week relationship you have sophomore year, where you kiss at the bus stop twice and then the person ghosts you. But it's still in your social studies class, which as an adult, you're like, what? But at 15 is like crushing.
Yeah. And again, doesn't get talked about enough, but that's just how teenage brains work.
Absolutely.
It's so true. And that's why you look at teenagers sometimes, and they can often look so much older than they are, and they do things. And we often will look at a mature teenage girl, for example, and not understand how much more development her brain needs to be ready.
She's a child. She's not fully formed. And that's why 16 and 17-year-olds, they're children, they're kids. And I think that that's something that I also am a big proponent too about, just like letting people be children. Yes, be responsible, be self-sufficient, employ your agency, but be a child. You have a whole life to be an adult. My 8-year-old daughter who wants to be like a 37-year-old human rights lawyer. And I'm just like, we can be 8 for as long as possible. And then we can be 9 as long as possible. You have a whole life to do all the incredible things you're going to do in your life. Let's just take our time.
Enjoy childhood.
I mean, the most important thing I'll do in my life is being a parent to my 2 kids. Everything else is like a footnote. It's by far the most challenging, important, all-consuming thing I have done or will ever do. It's terrifying in so many ways, which is like everything important should be terrifying. Like I remember when I got my MFA in creative writing a number of years ago at Warren Wilson College, the program was so challenging for me that I remember that I didn't buy anything from the school. Like I didn't buy any mugs or T-shirts or whatever, because I was like, it's going to be so painful if I fail at this thing that I want so badly. To be clear, I think it takes so much courage to pursue something you don't know you're going to succeed at and risk failure. To go back to the failure thing, I have a lot of practice doing that in my life that I'm very proud of myself. I think says something about who I am. I will never let my fear of the prospect of the devastation I'll feel at not succeeding at something I so deeply want to do well at. I mean, I often joke with people that like the inner emotional landscape of who I am is not conducive to being a parent because I'm so sensitive and so emotional, but I am thrilled to be a parent and terrified and want so badly to do it well and fail a lot, but continue to grow and try to be better every day.
Here's a good question because I can often find myself saying these kinds of things as well. I'm sure a lot of people do. What do you say to somebody that tells you that they are not creative?
I guess I would be a real teacher about it and say, what do you mean by that? I would give them a Socratic response. I mean, the question always to me, and this is, you're also asking somebody who's irreverent about genre, artistic classification, things like that. Like I'm always thinking, okay, cool. Like, what is this? Is this like a poem? Is this an essay? Is this like a performance piece? Is this a film? Like, yes, it's all of it. I mean, I think there's so many ways of being creative. You know, people often ask like my partner if she's an artist. And she says no, but she's like an incredible like crafter, and she'll make things cutting and gluing and things that honestly like look better than things put on Etsy. But she's doing it for her. Like she doesn't want to like sell it or build a career, which is totally fine, of course. Or like one of my dear friends, Kenda, she's like one of the best culinary artists I've ever met in my life. Like I think she could be a Michelin-starred chef if she wanted to, but she doesn't want to cook for a career. Like she wants to cook because it's her joy, and she makes beautiful things. I'm thinking both those people, like my partner and Kenda, are people who I think a lot of people wouldn't say these people are artists, but they're incredibly creative. I think there's so much stuff that's very American for me, where people really need delineations between categories. And I think there are a lot of things that are sort of geared toward appraisal or reduction rather than expansiveness. And I guess things that are more unapologetically like spiritual in nature. I think for me, there's so many creative ways. Like the creativity of just having to be a parent is ridiculous. Like I've never been more creative than just parenting my kids. You want to talk about psychology? Like in a span of 5 minutes, I've been like a coach, an inspirational speaker, a snuggle buddy, a psychologist. You go through all those things. You cajole, you coach, you like affirm, give them support to develop strategies, you suggest strategies. Talk about creativity. I mean, I think I would ask the greater question, what do you mean by that? And then second of all, like, why do you perhaps have a resistance to the classification of being creative? The what very rarely concerns me. The why is often something that's a lot more intriguing to me. And I think a lot of times it's even like people are afraid to call themselves a poet or a writer. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but forget all the gatekeepers. I've been widely published now. I was a poet before I published anything. Like, forget capitalism. I don't need like capitalism to tell me I'm a writer. If you write things, you're literally a writer. If you paint things, you're a painter. I think of the term creative like the term activist. Every single human being is an activist. It's just a matter of, so what are you doing or not doing, which is a doing in itself. The choices we make, the way we move through the world has causes and effects. Everyone's an activist. The idea that there aren't activists, that's a really destructive idea to me. We're all creative. It's just a matter of where does our creativity emerge and where are we willing to recognize it emerging? The greater why for me that I'm most concerned about with somebody who says they're not creative is people who are so reluctant or even feel like a certain degree of embarrassment to the possibility of calling themselves a thing that they aspire toward, that I would say they in fact are. Like someone's like, I really want to be a writer, but I can't afford to do an MFA. I'm too old now because I'm whatever. And I'm like, and what? Toni Morrison didn't publish her first novel until she was what, like 41, 43? In my opinion, the greatest American novelist of all time. How many great writers, artists didn't do anything before they were 40? 40 whoever, or didn't get MFAs or didn't do whatever. Like, who cares? I want to live in a world where we're all kind of in process together, trying to learn from each other, and a lot more interested in chasing down the greater questions of our existence and our personal journeys through our creative work, and less concerned with hierarchy or accolades or who's better than us and what's good. Like, who cares what's good? Does this thing we're creating call us to life and the people around us? Let's just be more interested in that and just know that the rest of the stuff will like work itself out, and it's not helpful to the work.
No, and it made me think as well. That does actually come back to that age thing. I find as I get older, the more comfortable I get doing things I'm not particularly good at. So like I'm in a dance class and I play sports and I do all these things, and I am by far probably the worst in the dance class, and it doesn't matter because I have a lot of fun. Who cares? And 100%. I think if I was in my early 20s, I would have been maybe a little bit more self-conscious.
The greater why underneath that too, and I'll just say that because that's something that I was ingrained into me. And again, this feels like something that was very American for me, is this idea of whatever you do, be the best. Whatever you pursue, win. Rather than just like, maybe the end is, oh my gosh, Bharatanatyam dancing brings me so much joy. That's the success.
And you know what I'm the best at, Carlos? I'm the best at having fun in everything I do.
You are. And that I
cheerleading for everyone around me and encouraging people to give it a shot. That's what I'm good at.
You're good at a lot of things, but that is absolutely unassailably something I've witnessed you be the best at.
Well, Carlos, thank you so much. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this has been so much fun.
Kristin, I could talk to you for the rest of the week. I love talking to you, but as long as the rest of the week would be filled with you telling stories about your life.
Next month, I'm joined by Prek, a fellow Siem Reap expat and a very talented graphic designer. She shares her personal experience with the creative process, how she goes about teaching design, and why she thinks creativity is so important. You won't want to miss it. Here's a short clip of what's to come.
Oh, I just love watching students slowly open up, and a major thing that I was hearing from people joining like the drawing course or the basic design classes were that they are limited creatively. They can't draw or they can't do this. And no, it's just a matter of learning what to do. And it's so cool to see people come in saying, I can't, and then leaving saying, wow, I can. I never knew, it's a very exciting part of the process.
Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time. Goodbye.